Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in this series of programs, we examine issues of public interest to the Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. And this year, we're observing the 25th anniversary of the start of a period of disorder, which resulted in what we call the Troubles. Many people don't know exactly what happened in 1999. Of course, you know that the president of the country at that time resigned, and a new president was selected in a constitutional fandango, which was quite amusing at that time. But it all happened in 1999, 25 years ago. But there were some other events, and we need to understand what happened, particularly in one village, which I think has been unfairly criticized and maybe even condemned, and that is the village of Buxton. In fact, Buxton Friendship, because many Buxtonians or many people from Friendship don't claim to be anything else other than Buxtonian, but that's a question for the villagers themselves. But Buxton Friendship has been stigmatized over the years, I think quite unfairly, because many things happened in and to Buxtonians which were not of their own making. And we all know from our study of Guyanese history that Buxton Village has been a significant social entity for more than a century and a half. There were times when, I think students of history could tell you, Buxtonians were the people who stood up, stood up to the governor, stood up to anything that they didn't agree with, anything they felt was unjust. So Buxton has always been, perhaps one of the most prominent communities, certainly for African Guyanese people. I mean, there are many, I don't want to make comparisons, but few villages could claim to be as resistant to their own perceptions of injustice as Buxton Friendship. And even with the coming of what is called universal adult franchise in the early 1950s, I think the former PPP General Secretary acknowledged that he got a lot of support from people in Buxton. Those were the days before, people were allowed to vote freely, because prior to universal suffrage, people had to have a property qualification or a salary qualification or a literacy qualification. So a lot of the poor people were disenfranchised, but many persons who were school teachers and lawyers and public servants to some extent, and people who were employed in sometimes at a very low level, but because they were literate and because they were receiving regular salaries, they had the franchise, and many of those people were African Guyanese. And for Dr. Jagan to be elected to the Legislative Council in 1947, he had to depend on the votes of non-Indians. And a lot of those votes came from villages like Victoria, Ansgrove, Buxton, Friendship, Plaisance. And I think that is well known, but Buxton Friendship was a concentration of a fairly well-educated number of persons, people who would enter the profession, particularly teaching, and the clergy. Many were Christians, many were literate, and Buxton was a place of significance. And of course, again, in an early program that I dealt with here on public interest, an early subject I dealt with in the 1960s, particularly in May 1964, Buxton again rose to prominence with the murder of two old Buxtonians, George and Yonosili. They went to their farm in the back dam, and the bodies were terribly mutilated. And that sparked a lot of anger, anger in the village and in other places such as Mackenzie, where Buxtonians had gone to work in the bauxite industry. And and before that, as you know, Buxton is not in the sugar belt, so it wasn't part of the disturbances. And many very eminent Guyanese, not necessarily African Guyanese, had come from Buxton. And one of them, one of the most eminent, of course, was Eugene Francis Correa, after whom our second international airport is named. He's a Buxtonian, born and bred in Buxton. So Buxton is not is not a sort of racial enclave of African Guyanese. Many prominent Guyanese of other ethnic groups came from Buxton. In fact, there was a very well-known philanthropist in Buxton called E.F. Fredericks, who was a lawyer. He set up the Buxton Scholarship. And the first person who won the Buxton Scholarship was, you're right, Balbir Nihal, who became the first Guyanese bacteriologist and pathologist. The first person to win the Buxton Scholarship was in India. So there we have it. So Buxton is a proud village. It resisted the governor, and I think some of you know this legend. It's not a false legend, it's a true story, that when the Buxtonians felt that the taxation was oppressive, and the governor was trying to go to Mahaika, I think, where the train line had just been laid. Buxton women just went on the train line and refused to move until the governor spoke to them. The story is, of course, Buxton people stopped train. So many people, even outside of Buxton, were very proud of that spirit of resistance. But after the coming of universal adult suffrage in 1950s, particularly the election in 1953, there was a competition, a rivalry for the votes in Buxton Friendship. In fact, throughout the whole lower East Demerara. And things became very sticky. But you will recall that in the 1970s, an organization called the Working People's Alliance was formed. One of the three leaders was U.C. Quayana, whose original name was Sidney King. He's now well known as U.C. Quayana. People don't refer to him as Sidney King any longer. But he was one of the three leaders, the three founders. You may call them founder leaders of the WPA. The other two were, of course, Brindley Horatio Benn, who was the founder of the Working People's Vanguard Party, and the other was a former member of the People's Progressive Party. And the three of them, one Indian, one and two Africans formed the WPA. So Moses Bagwan, formerly of the PPP, Brindley Benn, formerly of the PPP, and Sidney King, former of the PNC, and also former of the PPP. Bagwan, Benn, and King formed this Working People's Alliance. But by the 1970s, the Working People's Alliance had been joined by many young academics. Well, they might not have been academics, they're persons who had university degrees. But in the 1960s and 70s, that was it wasn't easy to come by an academic degree. And for various reasons that we don't need to go into, there was something called a civil rebellion. At that time, a group of young people in Nicaragua had seized power. And Daniel Ortega, he's still around, not so young. And then in Grenada, Morris Bishop, some other UE graduates had seized power in Grenada. They didn't hold elections, but they set up a revolutionary government in Grenada. And of course, in Suriname, young Army Sergeant Didi Boutese had seized power. So in Guyana, people felt that the way to power was by rebellion. And the WPA launched this civil rebellion. They don't deny it, so I speak openly and frankly. And they said it was aimed at removing the PNC administration. Uh, Up to quite recently, there are published reports in which WPA leaders acknowledged that there was a civil rebellion and admitted that the party had, and I quote, accumulated weapons to overthrow the government. Had accumulated weapons to overthrow the government. So the village became a place of interest um, in the security files. And as a result of that, the police started to pay more attention to what was taking place in Buxton Friendship. And it became a target of state violence, particularly through the Guyana Police Force and a special arm that was created called the Target Special Squad, the TSS, in the 1990s. My friends, the violence directed towards the village in the new century was calculated. A section of the police, the Target Special Squad, was based tactically at Cove and John police station on the east coast of Demerara. It's just about 8 kilometers away from Buxton, a very short drive. And at Vigilance, and Vigilance is very short distance away from Buxton, it's a few hundred meters. So on the one side, you had Cove and John police station and the Vigilance police station. And they were staffed with members of the TSS. Well, there were other policemen, in normal blue, but the TSS were special, a special group that had been set up by the police force at that time. And I think many Buxtonians up to now would remember the nicknames of some of the more notorious policemen of the day. One was called Babyface, another was called Golden Gun, one was called Guinness, another was called Toots. But you could ask any schoolboy on the East Coast and you could point to this man is Babyface, this one is Toots. And many others had reputation for violent behavior towards the villagers. That's why they were based. They didn't just come to respond to particular incidents or events. They were based on the Lower East Coast. And some of them, I'm not saying the ones I called, but some of them were feared because they were known to have killed many poor young African Guyanese over the years. So when we come to 1999, and my friend, please remember, we're not talking about prison escapees. We're talking about 1999. We're not talking about, people escaping from the Georgetown prison. We're still talking about 1999. So we have a situation now in which Buxton was a place of interest, and the police had created something, an operation. The police in the army always create operations. One is called Operation Hamburger. Well, you know what a hamburger is. You have 2 bits of bread and you have meat inside, and they're squeezed together. And I think people in Buxton felt that Operation Hamburger was meant to squeeze them. So you had police in Georgetown and Sparendam on the one side, and police at Vigilance and Cove and John on the other side, and in the center was Buxton Friendship. So it seemed to them that this concentration of police, particularly, was, and of course the launching of this Operation Hamburger, which some of you might never have heard about, was meant to squeeze Buxton, and squeeze it did. Now, what started to happen is that the police built up a sordid reputation of terrorizing young villagers. Many of them were subjected to arbitrary arrest No cause, they just arrested and taken down to the police station. Um, some of them were assaulted, beaten, even in public. Some of them were pushed into car trunks, um, shoved into car trunks, and of course the trunks closed on them. Some of them were forced to lie down on the floors of the police SUVs. And there were other forms of humiliation. So there was the arrest and assault and confinement in car trunks and people being thrown on the floor of SUVs, and other forms of humiliation. Some of them were forced to be detained overnight in the police stations. The trick was to catch them on Fridays or Saturdays, so they couldn't appeal to any magistrate to be released, or they couldn't get on to the lawyers. So the young boys from Buxton Friendship, sometimes they didn't know why they were arrested. They were just liming or something. The police just picked them up and carried them down there and confined them overnight in the police, what they call the lockups. They're forced to lie down on the floors sometimes. Things went on this way for a while until, and I mentioned the date specifically, the 6th of November 1999. This is just, 3 months after the new president had been sworn in. So there's no let up for the young people in Buxton Friendship. There was no new situation, but he was arrested and assaulted, and because of his status in the Buxton Friendship community, there was a protest, and many Buxtonians went down to Brickdam and protested in front of the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the minister listened to them, and the violence continued. So there was no change. But that angered, the Buxtonians, because the person they arrested was, not a violent character, and he was well respected in the community. But this is what became standard modus operandi for the TSS in those days. Now, elections were held, general and regional elections were held countrywide on the 19th of March 2001. Now, there was a polling station in one part of Buxton Friendship, and the rule was that the statements of polls should be posted there. So even before the results were declared, a couple of employees of the Election Commission tried to remove the SOPs. Well, some of the vigilant young people in Buxton said, no, you can't do that until the election results are declared. The SOPs must remain there. So they felt that there was a fiddle, and there was a confrontation. And next thing you know, the police turned up with reinforcements. Now, when the TSS comes on the scene, they don't ask questions. They started to throw smoke grenades, tear smoke grenades. And if you know the layout of housing in Buxton Friendship, they're very close together. There are no big open spaces in Savannah. So once you throw tear smoke, children and housewives and sick people in the homes are affected. And then the police started to shoot pellets to disperse the small group of non-violent boys who were protesting about the removal of the SOPs from the polling station. And a lot of people were shot, indiscriminately. And a lot of the families were affected by the tear smoke. So you can say that shortly after elections, there was some unrest. No riot, just unrest. Because time was going on and no declaration was being made. As you know, the PPP are very concerned about declaration of election results. But people were waiting a very long time in 2021. PPP appointed, chairman of the election commission, and PPP was in office. And people were wondering, well, when would the results be announced? And there was a lot of suspicion, there was a lot of tension in the village. So up to 2001, this is before the jailbreak, up to 2001, the protests were of a civil nature. They weren't politically driven. What is being politically driven was the behavior of the TSS, the Target Special Squad. They were behaving in response to political directions. They weren't simply trying to enforce the law, keep the peace. They were targeting young people in Buxton Friendship. And so, whatever restlessness there was in 2001 was because the villagers felt justifiably that they had been disenfranchised and they were being marginalized. Um, they felt that they had complied with the regulations for registration, but when they turned up to vote, many of the names were left off. We know there were problems in the GRE of 2001. They were very serious problems. I have some personal friends who lived in Meadowbrook who were told that they had to go to let them to vote. Another one had to go to Pomeroon. So it was a bit of, there had to be a bit of mischief to send so many people away from places which they could not conceivably reach. You were registered, but when you turn up to vote, feeling that you'd be registered at a particular polling station, you discover that your name was either not there or you were sent in some distant place. So there were complaints. And the restlessness that occurred was because many young people in that community um, felt they were being disenfranchised. Their names were being left off, although their names were on the official list of electors, they were not allowed to vote. When they turned up there, it seems that new official lists were printed without their names. So there might have been errors, but there was unrest. What I could say is that this unrest could have been dealt with in a more, I would say, peaceful manner. But by turning out the police, it became violent. So what happened in later that month is that the police reinforcements were brought to the three police stations in that area, uh, particularly Vigilance and Cowan John, and the GDF was also deployed. Now, in most democratic states, army is not called out on the streets for law enforcement functions. This is the job of the police. Army is called out to defend the borders, to go in the hinterland, to prevent illegal entry, to prevent the garimperos from the sindicatos from coming into our country. Civil law enforcement is a matter for the police, directing traffic and arresting cows, bird thief. People thief somebody bird cage or something like that. Dispersing unlawful assembly. The police is bigger than the army, and the police has a function in law enforcement. But by deploying the army prematurely, as early 2001, I think that it signaled they were going to try to suppress whatever restlessness they were with an iron fist. Um, so there was no great disorder that justified the calling out of the army, but nevertheless, the army was called. But from May, 8th of May, or thereabouts, disorder started to become more intense. And this was exacerbated by the shooting of the villagers with pellets and the throwing of tear smoke grenades affecting women and children in the housing in the houses in the village. Um, in fact, on the 22nd of March alone, about 14 persons were injured. And people in Buxton can give you the names. So this wasn't make believe. So there was a series of events. One, the public roads, the village streets were blocked. to prevent the police from rushing through. Because the TSS used to rush through and fire in the air and throw tear smoke. It was really a very bad situation. Um, the people started to start fires on the public road. A China bomb was thrown into a minibus. A businessman was arrested and released, and then some murders which took place in neighboring villages. People don't even know why they were killed. It's some family dispute, but everybody felt, not everybody, but the general rumor was that, the Buxtonians had committed these murders. And then you had the deployment of the army and the police force. Finally, by middle of May, the 19th of May, because of an agreement between the leader of the PNC and the president, the leader of the opposition, and the leader of the government, if you want to call it that, something called the Committee on Depressed Communities was convened, and they started to listen to the complaints of the people in Buxton Friendship. So there was an attempt to be rational or reasonable, and unfortunately, copycat this restlessness started in other villages which had similar complaints. Haslington, Anscrew, Victoria, and so on. And as a result of that, police started to put down more roadblocks, and within 4 days they put down 40 roadblocks, and within the same 4 days, 30 of them were burnt by the villagers themselves. So you started to get a two-sided confrontation. And after a while, bad elements, these are not legitimate protesters who were disenfranchised, but bad people started to infiltrate the protests and started stoning vehicles and robbing passengers in minibuses. So for a while, school children couldn't attend school and workers couldn't get to work because of the growing disorder. So you can see how a small incident escalated to, a community-wide protest. So in modern societies, it is normal for the civil police, the boys in blue shirts and so on, to perform law enforcement functions. It is not normal for the army to be deployed to normal law enforcement duties. And when the army is deployed prematurely, it means that they will be shooting, there will be a lot of force being used, and it shows that there's escalation in violence, and this itself could ignite instability. Now, as I said, one of the purposes of the public interest is not just to narrate events, and it's certainly not to blame anybody, but I just try to show in this program that, what we know of Buxton is only part of the story. And on another occasion, we will deal with what happened after 2001. But everything I've said so far is only up to 2001. It doesn't deal with the jailbreak. It doesn't deal with the violence that became associated with Buxton from 2002 onwards. What I would say is that in looking at the situation in Buxton, particularly in 1999, 2000, 2001, up to the elections of 2001, we can see that there were several errors in law enforcement, and we can learn several lessons from those errors. The first lesson is that when a situation is rotten or is deteriorating, it will continue to deteriorate unless there is deliberate reform. If a system is rotten, it cannot change itself. There needs to be some external force which remedies or corrects or reforms the decaying organism. That is a fact of biology, if you want to call it that. I don't want to use scientific terms, but there was rot in the police force, and that rot was not being corrected by reform measures which were being recommended by the British government, the Department for International Development, since 1999. Those reform measures were being ignored, and the rot continued. Second lesson that we learned is that once there's repression of citizens, no matter how poor they are, once there's repression, there'll be resistance. Um, People cannot live forever, under the type of subjugation, the threats which I've described to you coming from the police, particularly the TSS in Buxton Friendship. The arrests, the assaults, the detention, and the lockups, the beatings, and after a while, just people just got fed up and started to resist the police. They blocked the streets to stop the police from driving through. That's why they blocked the streets, um, to stop the police from driving through and shooting. The third lesson we learned is that professional organizations, particularly in the security and defense forces, are governed by laws. And it's something called the Police Act. And the Police Act it forbids the interference of politically elected ministers from giving operational orders to the police. Running the police force is a job for professionally trained and competent police officers. An elected minister or politician doesn't have that training and doesn't have that competence. And when you have politically appointed ministers interfering in the professional administration of the police force, there will be problems, because the people who have to live with the consequences of that interference are not the ministers. They're the policemen and the victims of that interference, who are the private citizens, especially in this case in Buxton Friendship. And I would mention the fourth issue in our little case study today is that in disconnected communities, social relations will degenerate. Do not take social relations for granted. Social relations could degenerate or will degenerate unless positive measures are implemented to ensure, to strengthen social cohesion. Social cohesion is not a phenomenon that occurs by itself. People have to actively implement measures to bring communities together. Otherwise, like a rotten mango in the sun or a rotten egg, it will continue to deteriorate. If you wish to have a cohesive society, the government, civil society, and other organizations must consciously work together to remove the elements which prevent unity, which prevent cohesion. There's no point talking about corridor of unity, there's no point talking about one Ghana. And you do nothing to remove the real causes of grievance. So those are the four lessons I would like to leave with you on this program, with the unrest in Buxton before the jailbreak, the rot in the police force will continue unless there is serious reform. The repression of citizens will always be resented and resisted. Political interference will undermine the professional competence of trained police officers, and social relations will deteriorate unless there is a real attempt to ensure that social cohesion measures are implemented. So, my friends, the roots of unrest in Buxton Friendship should be understood. I'm not trying to remove blame from any bad elements. All I'm trying to do is to encourage you to examine the situation for yourself in Buxton Friendship. There were bad elements there, and many of them have done wrong things and brought discredit to the village, to the community, which the forefathers worked so hard to build. But Buxton Friendship had a powerful reputation as a valiant village that was unafraid to speak up, to make its voice heard when faced with injustice. And it was evident in this case that at the time of the elections in 2001, there was disenfranchisement, there was economic discrimination, and there was unequal treatment of villagers. And the callous application of state violence in the form of intolerable cruelty by the Target Special Squad was responsible for generating a very bad situation which deteriorated even further in 2002. We must try to ensure that those measures, the rot in the police force, the repression of citizens, the political interference in the management of the police force, and the deteriorating social relations do not go unattended and allow our country to continue to drift into the disorder and the violence that we saw during the troubles between 2000 and 2010. We need to look after the future of our children. We need to prevent any form of violence, particularly state violence, from damaging our beautiful country. Thank you, and may God bless you.